Velmi jednoduché. Je mi velkým potěšením přivítat zde pana Segalla, autora knihy. Chtěla bych mu za mě poděkovat za to, že přijal naše pozvání a že se s námi podělí o své zkušenosti. Na začátek bych představila pana Josefa Žáka. Je to obchodní a marketingový ředitel společnosti Albatros Media, pana Petra Baláše, ředitel knižních redakcí. Vedle pana Segalla sedí Vendula Kůrková, redaktorka nakladatelství Bizbooks a paní Aneta Zímová za agenturu Blue Events. Ráda bych poprosila pana Petra Baláše, jestli by nám neřekl pár slov o nakladatelství Bizbooks, ve kterém knížka vyšla.
Nakladatelství Bizbooks je jedním z 10 nakladatelství společnosti Albatros Media. Je to naše nejmenší nakladatelství, vydávající už jen velké knihy. Nakladatelství Bizbooks vychází knihy o managementu, o ekonomice, o marketingu, o financích, osobních financích a zabývající se vlastně celým tématem ekonomicko-manažerských knížek. Knížka šíleně jednoduše je naším letošním bestsellerem a my velmi doufáme, že setkání s panem Segallem pomůže tuto pozici utvrdit a podpořit.
Tak, děkuji. Jistě by vás zajímalo, proč jsme vlastně tuhle knihu vydali, proč jsme si tohleto téma zvolili. Zde bych poprosila Vendulu Kůrkovou, redaktorku, vlastně díky ní a její úžasné volbě jsme dnes tady.
Děkuji za to. Tak knihu šíleně jednoduché jsme si vybrali v nakladatelství Bizbooks zcela jednoduše, protože se nám velice líbil ten nápad, celá myšlenka té knihy, vlastně posedlost jednoduchostí, což je věc, kterou můžete vidět vlastně v celé práci společnosti Applem. A tady ten princip jednoduchosti vlastně, ačkoliv se může zdát, že knížka je o marketingu a určená převážně pro lidi, kteří se zabývají marketingem, tak to, co nás na ní zaujalo, je to, že podle autora vlastně ta jednoduchost ji lze aplikovat úplně na všechny aspekty podnikání, řízení firmy, chodu firmy, ale vlastně i na osobní život. A dalším důležitým důvodem, proč jsme si vybrali tento titul, byla samozřejmě osobnost autora, protože jsme přesvědčeni, že takový autor, člověk typu pana Segall zcela jistě má co předat i českým čtenářům, takže to byl další důvod. A pak pochopitelně kniha je velice dobře napsaná, zajímavá, vtipná, srozumitelná, doplněná o řadu osobních historek z firmy Apple se Stevem Jobsem, takže skutečně na příkladech se můžete naučit, jak jednoduchostí dosáhnout největšího úspěchu.
Děkuji, Vendule. Kniha pojednává samozřejmě o Steve Jobsovi. Zeptám se pana Žáka, máme v portfoliu nakladatelství Bizbooks nebo v dalších našich nakladatelstvích knih s podobnou tematikou?
Děkuji, já vás ještě zdravím. Téma Apple a Steve Jobs je v produkci Bizbooks zastoupeno několika tituly, které sledují jednak osobnost samotného Steva Jobse, tak i anatomii úspěchu jeho osobní i firmy Apple. Jednak jde o titul Jak myslí Steve Jobs, dále kniha Tajemství inovací Steva Jobse, dále jsme komiks Steve Jobs, nebo titul Uvnitř společnosti Apple.
Tak, děkuji. Vlastně zítra se koná také konference Marketing Management 2013 na Žofíně, na které vlastně pan Segall představí tajemství svého úspěchu nebo tajemství úspěchu Apple díky jeho práci. Poprosím Anetu Zímovou, jestli by nám vlastně představila, co zítra nás bude čekat. Díky.
Já to budu říct velmi jednoduché a marketing management je největší setkání České republice pro marketéry a kreativce a zítra kromě Gina Segalla vystoupí například David Cooperberg z izraelských Mindscapes. Budou představeny hravé marketingové počiny z celého českého trhu a na konec bude vyhlášena agentura roku, takže se máte určitě na co těšit.
Děkuji. A teď už bych velmi ráda předala slovo našemu váženému hostu, aby vlastně sám svými slovy představil tuto úžasnou knihu.
Greetings. I have no idea what anybody just said. I'm just kidding. Really good translation. Thank you. It is my great pleasure to be here in Prague. I've never been to the Czech Republic in my life, and I feel really awful about that now, but I finally made it. It's been gorgeous, and I was lamenting to my hosts that we don't have anything in the US that's older than about 100 years old. So it's really just great. The history of this place is great, and I've been getting quite an education. But I also want to congratulate my publishers here, because the cover of the book is beautiful, and you would be surprised how not true that is in certain countries that have chosen to do their own thing to the book. This looks very much like the US version. But anyway, it's done very tastefully, and I appreciate that. So I just wanted to, give you a little bit of an intro to myself and the book, and then we can chat about it if you wish. But I am really just an advertising guy. I was a copywriter by trade, and I rose through the ranks of advertising, and I ended up working on the Apple business when Steve Jobs was not there, when John Scully was the head of Apple. And then from there, I had the opportunity to go work on the next computer business, which was the company that Steve Jobs started when he was thrown out of Apple in 1985. So I was his ad agency creative director for 8 years, actually. That's how I got to know Steve and work with him, and it was an interesting time because Next was not nearly as successful, obviously, as Apple. But I worked with him well and was able to survive intact, because people know that Steve had a bit of a temper, but if you worked well with him, good things happened. So when he came back to Apple in 1997, actually an interesting opportunity for me, because the ad agency was TBWA Chiat Day, who had done the original Macintosh advertising with Steve Jobs. I had worked at Chiat Day 3 previous times. I had worked with Steve Jobs on Next, and I had worked on Apple in a different place. And for the first time in 1997, I had a chance to work on all 3 of those things together. Chiat, the agency, Steve Jobs, and Apple, and it was a really, really great combination. So I went and took that job, even though, to be honest, I had only been working at my current job for 4 weeks when the opportunity came up, and everybody hated me for quitting. But it was too big of an opportunity, and so I went to work on Apple at that point more. And we did the Think Different campaign. And I don't like to brag, so with humility, I will say, I am the guy who came up with the I. I named the iMac, and it turned into something a bit bigger. And it's somewhat embarrassing because I've written many longer things in my life, but the single letter I is the one thing that I get credit for. So that was a fun thing. And there's an interesting story about that in the book. I won't totally spoil it for you, but Steve Jobs didn't like the name iMac. And we went back and forth on that for a couple of weeks until finally he was convinced that that was a good thing. But well, I'll give it away now because it's kind of out there anyway. But Steve Jobs had a name in mind for the iMac that he liked better, and that name was MacMan. And shocked all of us because we thought it was a terrible name, but we went back and forth and finally talked him into iMac, and all the I things happened afterwards. And we think that's a good thing, because if MacMan was the way it went, then you might well be talking on your phone man or your pod man listening to your music. So it's a good thing that the agency stood firm on that one. Anyway, in later years I went and worked on Intel and Dell in particular, and I did the same role for them. And the reason I mention that is that had I only worked with Steve Jobs and Apple and Next, I probably wouldn't have written the book, to be honest, because I would have thought it was an interesting experience, but a lot of people wrote books about on that topic. But when I worked with these other companies, Dell and Intel in particular, I realized how complicated things could be. From the marketing point of view, from creating advertising, these other companies had such incredibly complicated systems where it would take us 3 times as long, and we'd have to spend a lot more money conducting focus groups all around the world and modifying the things and doing different versions of the things, whereas at Apple, it just happened. Steve Jobs would approve an idea and we'd go off and create the work. It seemed so much simpler. So the more I worked for these complicated companies, I realized that there was a reason why Apple succeeded on such a spectacular level, and these other companies, they did well, but they made things very, very painful, and the work that they ended up with wasn't nearly as good as what Apple did. So I had been observing for all these years how simple Steve liked to keep things. He didn't like to work like a big company, and that's when he would get kind of brutal, was when people started exhibiting the behaviors of a large company. So he would smack them down in his inimitable way and keep things simple. So the idea of the book really was that if I captured this sense of simplicity that Steve Jobs believed in, that it could be applied to so many different businesses, and that other people could benefit from the value that helped drive Apple. And it was a theory when I wrote the book, but it's actually turned into reality, thankfully, that the types of companies that have invited me in since I wrote the book have been all over the place. We have like government agencies and banks and lawyers, all these different kinds of industries that are interested. They're all fascinated by Apple and by the personality of Steve Jobs. And you know, because everyone's using the products, it's interesting how the principles that drive Apple can be so easily and with great benefit applied to different kinds of companies. So I wrote the book and all that happened, and I spent the last year just talking incessantly about it, which has been a lot of fun for me. So again, I'm seeing places I've never seen. So for me personally, as a human being, it's really interesting and fun to see these places and meet all these fabulous people. And you could be more. If we talk afterwards, I'll meet you too. I think that's kind of it for my intro. I'd be happy to chat it up and answer any questions or whatever you have in mind. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Tak, teď jsou právě nastává ta chvíle, kdy je prostor pro vaše dotazy. Já v podstatě bych sama za sebe nebo za nakladatele, mě by zajímalo, jestli třeba plánujete napsat nějaké pokračování, nebo jestli můžeme čekat nějakou další knihu od vás.
Actually, yes, and I'm behind schedule already. I have, there are like 3 ideas for the next book, and I'm in the discussion process with my publisher, with my agent and my publisher in the US. So hopefully, I think it'll happen faster this time, but you know, probably be about 12 months before it was in the market. So it's another Apple-related kind of a thing. It's likely going into the direction of how one actually implements the simplicity principles. Because when Steve Jobs returned to Apple in 1997, he had been away for 11 or 12 years, and the company had become extremely bloated, and they were fairly mediocre. Their products were not very exciting. And Steve actually turned that mediocre company into something simpler and more successful. So I think there are really some interesting lessons in there about exactly how he did it that, again, can be applied to other companies. There are such colorful phrases that were born of Steve's changing of Apple, like, I'm going to fire all the bozos, things like that. It has to do with getting the smartest, best people, really, and giving them the power to actually drive the company. And I think a lot of companies get so bloated, their processes take over, and I think if you sort of lay out a roadmap, it would be based on what Steve did. I think it would be very beneficial for a lot of companies. So I'm pretty sure that's the direction the new book takes.
Perfect, thank you. Takže obracím se na vás, otázky z publika.
Dobrý den, Kateřina Media budu. Já bych se vás chtěla zeptat, jak si myslíte, že bude vypadat bez Steva Jobse, nebo jakou předpovídáte budoucnost? Můžete jakou budoucnost předpovídá Apple bez Steva Jobse?
Always a good question, and I do hear that one often. And I'd start by saying I own a lot of stock in Apple, and I haven't sold it yet, so I'm still a believer. I think what it really boils down to is values, and Steve Jobs had these incredibly strong values that he refused to compromise on. And the analogy I like to use is just a parent raising a child. You instill your values in the child, but at a certain point you don't control anymore. The child goes off to school and profession and then lives alone and operates in a different world that you can't control. Well, you know, the child's values are what keeps him or her on the right path. So I think Steve instilled his values in Apple, and Apple as a company encounters circumstances, opportunities, and challenges that Steve could never have foreseen. So it is simply up to the current leaders to act based on those values. And I think they really do have those values. They're very, very well burnt into the company. But again, the circumstances they meet up with in future years are things that Steve Jobs, you know, you can never really know what he would have done. But you just, as he himself encouraged the company to do, don't think about what I would do, just think about what the right thing to do is. And I think by that he meant, you know what this company is all about, and you know how we should respond to certain situations. So I don't share some of the recently expressed concerns about the doom that is possible. People are all upset because Apple doesn't seem to be innovating as much, and I think they're pretty much on the same schedule they've always been. Every 3 years something big happens, kind of. And this is the 3rd year since iPad. So I imagine we're going to be seeing things this year. But again, the world changes too. There may not be the huge revolutions anywhere anymore. It might be more incremental. One never knows. But I have confidence, and I'm not selling yet.